My name is Chloe, and I work as an editor at a prominent publishing company in the city. I've always been a regular girl, keeping things simple. Life's been a bit of a hustle, balancing deadlines and carving out some me time. Maybe that's why I never really got into the dating scene. I usually preferred my own company, with a good book or a quiet walk in the park near my apartment. But everything changed on a sunny Saturday that seemed just like any other. I was lost in a podcast, strolling through the park without a care in the world. The park was lively with people and their pets, and kids were running around full of energy. I must have lost track of where I was walking because suddenly, a guy on a bicycle nearly collided with me. "Watch it," he yelled, swerving at the last second. His tone was harsh, clearly annoyed. Startled, I quickly pulled out one earbud and blurted out, "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I'd wandered onto the bike path." He stopped his bike and turned around, looking more amused than angry now. "You've got to watch where you're going. This path is a jungle sometimes." "Yeah, my bad," I admitted, feeling a bit embarrassed. I brushed a stray lock of hair from my face and gave him a sheepish smile. He laughed, and just like that, the tension seemed to dissolve. "I'm Ryan," he said, extending a hand. "Chloe," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm and confident. "So, Chloe, are you always this distracted, or is it just my charming presence?" he asked with a cheeky grin that made me chuckle. "It's just been a long week at work. My brain's already off enjoying the weekend," I said. "Fair enough. I was just about to grab a coffee at that place over there," he said, pointing to a small cafe at the edge of the park. "Care to join me? As a peace offering for almost sending me flying." I considered it for a moment. He seemed nice, and honestly, I could use a coffee. Sure, why not? I could use a good coffee and a story to tell. As we walked to the cafe, Ryan was easy to talk to. He told me about his job at a car sales company and how he liked to spend his weekends biking or hanging out with friends. He wasn't from the city. He had moved here because he thought it offered more opportunities. Big city dreams, he said with a smirk. I shared a bit about my job too, explaining how much I loved books and ended up making a career out of that passion. "It beats being stuck in a cubicle doing something you hate," I added. We reached the cafe and ordered our coffees. While we waited, I couldn't help but notice how comfortable I felt around him. It was strange because I'm usually a bit reserved around new people, but with Ryan, the conversation just flowed. After meeting Ryan, we started hanging out more. He was funny and easygoing, but it wasn't long before I started noticing little things that bugged me. It was nothing major at first, just small comments here and there that made me raise an eyebrow. One Saturday, we went out for dinner, and somehow, the topic of careers and family came up. We were just chatting about work and life, nothing serious, or so I thought. "So, how's the book world treating you?" Ryan asked, taking a sip of his beer. "It's busy as always. Deadlines don't stop for anyone," I replied, poking at my salad. "Yeah, I get that. But you wouldn't want to be stuck in that forever, right? I mean, eventually, you'd want to settle down. Maybe cut back on work hours," Ryan said casually. I paused, fork midair. "Not really, Ryan. I love what I do. I don't see myself giving it up anytime soon, or ever really." Ryan shrugged. "Sure, but what about when we have kids? Wouldn't you want to be around more?" The question caught me off guard. I chuckled nervously. "That's jumping way ahead, don't you think?" He laughed it off. "Yeah, you're right. Just thinking out loud, I guess." I tried to shake off the discomfort, but it lingered. A couple of weeks later, Ryan invited me to have dinner with his parents. I figured it was a good sign, things getting serious and all. I was nervous but hopeful. The dinner, though, opened my eyes a bit more. His parents lived in a cozy, well-kept house in the suburbs. His mom, Mrs. Lewis, was all smiles when we arrived. "Chloe, so lovely to finally meet you. Ryan has told us so much about you," she gushed, pulling me into a hug. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Lewis. It's great to meet you too," I managed to say, returning her smile. Dinner was served, and everything was going well until Mrs. Lewis started talking about family and marriage. "You know, Ryan was always the responsible one," Mrs. Lewis said as she served herself more potatoes. "We've always told him the importance of finding a good girl who knows her way around the house." Ryan's dad nodded in agreement. "Absolutely. It's about building a good foundation. A man needs to provide, and a woman, well, she takes care of the home." I glanced at Ryan, hoping he'd say something, but he just focused on his food. Mrs. Lewis continued, "It's how we raised our boys. Family first, right, Ryan?" "Right, Mom," Ryan said, finally looking up. His agreement felt like a punch to the gut. I tried to stay calm. "It's interesting because I've always been pretty career-oriented," I said. "I love my job and believe in contributing equally." Mrs. Lewis smiled, but it felt a bit too sweet. "Of course, dear, but you'll see, priorities change when you start having children. It's only natural for a woman to want to stay at home with her babies." The rest of the evening felt like a fog. We left shortly after dinner, and the drive home was tense. I broke the silence. "Your mom has some strong opinions about family roles." Ryan hesitated before responding. "I think there's some truth to it. I mean, it worked for my parents." Despite the uneasy dinner with Ryan's parents, our relationship continued. Somehow, the good times seemed to outweigh the bad, and I found myself agreeing to marry him. Looking back, love must have blinded me because those warning bells were still ringing in the back of my mind. The wedding planning started, and it was a whirlwind. Ryan wanted something simple, and so did I. We decided on a modest ceremony with just close family and friends. As the day approached, the real pressure began to mount, not about the event itself, but about what our lives would become afterward. At the reception after the ceremony, Ryan's mom pulled me aside. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were serious. "Chloe, dear, I'm so happy for you both. Remember, a good wife supports her husband no matter what." "Thank you, Mrs. Lewis. I intend to be a supportive partner," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "And remember, dear, when the babies start coming, it's best if you're at home. You can't trust strangers to raise your children." Her words felt like a warning, and the finality in her tone made my stomach churn. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Later, Ryan and I had a moment alone. "Your mom talked to me about kids and me not working," I said, watching his reaction closely. "Yeah, she's just looking out for the future. She means well, Chloe, you know how moms are," Ryan said, brushing it off as he took a sip of his champagne. "But you know I'm not planning to quit my job, right? Even when we have kids," I pressed, needing him to understand. Ryan paused, his face serious. "We'll see, Chloe. Things change. We'll do what's best for our family." After our wedding, Ryan suggested we move to a larger apartment closer to his work at the car sales company. The place was nice and bigger than our old one, but it was right next door to his parents' house. I had my suspicions about why he chose this particular spot, but I agreed, hoping for the best. Once we settled in, the reality of our new life together began to surface. Ryan started bringing up his idea of a traditional family more often, where he would be the breadwinner and I would handle the house and eventually the kids. One evening, we sat down with our finances spread across the dining table, a mess of bills and budgets under the dim light. I tried to show him how keeping both our jobs was more beneficial, especially with the economy being unstable. "Look at these numbers, Ryan. With both incomes, we're not just getting by. We're actually saving. It makes no sense for me to quit my job," I said, pointing at the spreadsheet. Ryan shook his head, pushing the papers away slightly. "It's not just about the money, Chloe. It's about having a real family life, you know, like my parents had." I sighed, my frustration growing. "But it's not the past, Ryan. Things are different now. We both need to contribute." He didn't seem convinced, and the discussion ended with a heavy silence. The situation became even more complicated with his mother, Mrs. Lewis, living so close. She dropped by often, unannounced, each visit bringing a new critique about how I was managing our home. One afternoon, I was sorting through work emails when Mrs. Lewis came in without a word. She immediately started inspecting the house, wiping her finger along the bookshelf to check for dust. "Chloe, you really should focus more on keeping a cleaner house. A dusty home isn't a healthy home," she said sharply. I clenched my teeth, trying to stay calm. "I cleaned yesterday, Mrs. Lewis, and I work full-time. It's just a little dust." "That's just it. You work too much. If you were home more, maybe things wouldn't slip through," she countered, moving over to the linen closet and pulling out a sheet to check for signs of improper laundering. I followed her, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "I manage my time just fine, Mrs. Lewis. Ryan and I are both happy with how things are." She tutted, shaking her head, and moved to the kitchen to scrutinize the contents of our fridge. "A woman's place is taking care of her home and her husband. These modern ideas about women needing careers are nonsense." Every comment stung, and I felt my defenses rise. "Maybe that worked for you, but I'm not you. I'm not just going to quit my job to become someone I'm not." When Ryan came home that evening, I tried to explain how suffocating his mother's visits were becoming. He listened, but his response chilled me. "Mom's just trying to help Chloe. She has a lot of experience running a home. But it's our home, not hers. I need you to stand up for me, for us," I pleaded. Ryan looked torn but finally said, "She's my mom, Chloe. She means well. We should at least consider her advice." The argument that night was long and painful. We went to bed angry, marking the start of many silent nights. As the days turned into weeks, I felt more like an intruder in my own home, constantly judged and found wanting. The pressure to conform to outdated ideas of what a wife should be was relentless, and my resolve to maintain my independence was tested every day. As the months went by, Ryan's nagging about me not pulling my weight at home increased. He would come home from work, look around with a scowl, and comment on the dusty shelves, or the dinner that was either too bland or overcooked because I'd rushed it after a long day at the publishing house. His favorite refrain became, "If you can't manage both, maybe you shouldn't be working." One evening, after a particularly harsh critique of some slightly undercooked pasta, Ryan let it drop. "Chloe, I'm serious. If you can't meet me halfway and take care of the house properly, maybe we should rethink this whole arrangement," he said, implying that divorce was on the table. Despite everything, I loved Ryan and didn't want our marriage to fail over this. So I made a decision that pained me deeply. The next day, I talked to my boss, Jessica, about quitting my job to become a full-time housewife. Jessica was shocked and tried to persuade me otherwise. "Chloe, you're one of our best. Are you sure about this?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "I don't see any other way, Jessica. I have to try to make things work at home," I admitted, feeling defeated. Jessica, ever the problem solver, proposed a compromise. "What if you could work from home and manage your projects remotely? It's becoming more common now. You wouldn't have to quit." The idea seemed like a lifeline, so I agreed to the arrangement but decided not to tell Ryan. Instead, I told him I had resigned. He was overjoyed, thinking I had chosen our home life over my career. So I started my new role as a housewife, seeing Ryan off to work each morning and greeting him when he came home. But as soon as he left, I powered up my laptop and dove into my editing work. It was a strange double life, but it worked. I saved the money I earned from my remote job in a separate bank account, just in case. However, living on just Ryan's salary proved tougher than we thought. Despite my best efforts to economize, 3 months later, we were scraping the bottom of the barrel. I tried to bring up the topic gently. "Ryan, I think it might be necessary for me to go back to work." We're running through our savings too fast." Ryan's reaction was swift and angry. "That's because you're spending too much. You need to learn how to save properly," he snapped. I was stunned. I hadn't bought anything for myself in months, and always hunted for the cheapest deals at the supermarket. His words hurt deeply, mixing anger and humiliation inside me. The next day, his mother came over with a mission to teach me proper budgeting. She dragged me to the store and pointed out the cheapest, often poorest quality products. "Buy these, Chloe. Stop wasting money on expensive stuff," she lectured as we walked down the aisles. Back home, she showed me how to dilute dish soap to make it last longer. "You use too much. You need to make do with less," she instructed, her tone patronizing. She even started checking my receipts, scolding me for any purchase she deemed unnecessary. Mrs. Lewis's disapproval seemed never-ending. "Why are you buying this? Just stick to the basics," she would say, shaking her head in disapproval. Living like this was unbearable. Every day felt more suffocating than the last. I was losing my sense of self to their imposed austerity, trapped under constant surveillance. The situation was becoming untenable. I felt confined in a life of pretended submission, with every part of me screaming for escape. But for now, I held on, biding my time and carefully planning my next steps. Everything reached a boiling point one drizzly Tuesday evening. I was on the phone in the living room, pouring my heart out to my mom. "I just don't know how much more I can take, Mom. His mother is constantly over here, teaching me how to stretch $1 until it screams. I get it, we need to save, but this is too much." Mom's voice was a mix of concern and anger. "Chloe, that's not normal. You need to have a conversation with Ryan about boundaries. It's your home too, not just his or his mother's playground." Just as I was nodding, feeling a bit strengthened by my mom's support, Ryan stormed in from the other room, his face red with anger. He must have overheard me complaining. He snatched the phone right out of my hand. A wife shouldn't be complaining about her husband and mother-in-law like some street gossip. He snapped into the phone before hanging up. I was shocked, my hand shaking slightly. "Ryan, you can't just grab my phone and talk to my mom like that." "Oh, I can't? Maybe if you had some respect for us, I wouldn't have to," he retorted, his voice rising. I could see the veins in his neck bulging. "Ryan, listen to yourself. Can't you see this isn't healthy?" I pleaded, hoping to reach some part of him that remembered what love felt like. But he was beyond reason. "Healthy? My mom was right. I should never have married you," he spat out, his words cutting deeper than I expected. "That's enough, Ryan. I'm your wife, not some puppet you and your mom can control," I snapped back, my anger flaring. "Then act like it or leave," he shouted, his face inches from mine. I stared at him, disbelief and sadness warring inside me. "You want me to leave? At 4 a.m.? It's dark and pouring rain outside." "If you don't like how things are, then yes, get out," he replied coldly, his eyes unyielding. I knew then that nothing I said would change his mind or the situation. Shaking, I grabbed a few essentials, my laptop, some clothes, and my phone. When I went for my purse, Ryan was quicker, snatching it away. "You think you're leaving with this? I earned this money, not you." "Fine, keep it," I said, my voice hollow. I couldn't believe this was happening. I called a taxi and waited by the door, my heart pounding. The taxi pulled up, and I stepped out into the cold night air, drenched by the rain. As I climbed into the car, a strange calm settled over me. I was doing this. I was leaving. At the hotel, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, I felt a surge of relief amidst the turmoil. Despite everything, I hadn't quit my job. My secret savings account, unknown to Ryan, was now my lifeline. As dawn broke, I got up, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. Today was the day I would take control back. I had an appointment with a lawyer to discuss filing for divorce. It felt surreal, like a scene from someone else's life. The lawyer's office was a stark, unassuming place tucked between a row of old brick buildings. Inside, Mr. Baker, my lawyer, was a straightforward man who wasted no time. "Let's get down to business," he said as soon as I sat down. "You're here to file for divorce, correct?" "Yes," I confirmed, my voice steadier than I expected. "I can't go back to the way things were." Mr. Baker nodded seriously. "All right, I'll need all the details. Any joint accounts, property, anything that needs untangling." We spent the next hour going over everything. He explained the legal process, what I could expect, and what my rights were. He was thorough, ensuring I understood every step before drawing up the necessary documents. "You'll need to serve these to your husband," he instructed, handing me an envelope sealed with a stamp that felt like the seal on my old life. Armed with the divorce papers, I went back to the apartment I had shared with Ryan. He was still asleep, probably exhausted from the previous night's fallout. The apartment felt different as I packed my things. Every item I tucked away marked the end of another shared chapter. By the time I finished packing, Ryan stirred awake and wandered into the kitchen, his eyes blurry and confused by the sight of my bags piled by the door. "What's going on?" he mumbled, scratching his head. I didn't have much to say. My actions spoke louder than words. Instead of answering, I handed him the envelope. "These are for you," I said, my voice betraying none of the emotions I felt inside. Ryan tore open the envelope, his frown deepening as he read the contents. "Divorce?" He laughed, disbelief coloring his tone. "You think you can just walk out, and everything will be all right?" He looked up from the papers, his eyes cold. "Come back when you're ready to apologize, and maybe I'll consider taking you back. But remember, you'll have to listen to my mother from now on." The absurdity of his words almost made me laugh, but I kept it in check. "I'm not coming back, Ryan. I'm done. We're done." Walking out of that apartment, the air felt different, crisper, almost hopeful. I went straight to the new place I had rented days before. It was small but entirely mine, a place where I could start rebuilding. Each step felt heavy but right. A few weeks after moving in, I returned to the office, immersing myself in the whirlwind of publishing deadlines and author meetings. Being around my colleagues again, feeling the familiar rush of approaching deadlines, reignited a spark in me that I thought I had lost. The familiar landscape of texts and typos was more comforting than I had imagined it would be. During this time, I reconnected with old friends, people who had known me long before Ryan. We met for drinks after work and shared meals on weekends. Slowly, I began to feel more like myself than I had in years. The laughter and lighthearted teasing grounded me, and in their company, I rediscovered parts of myself that I had forgotten. A few months into this new phase, I received an unexpected call from Ryan. His voice was awkward and tinged with desperation. "Hey, Chloe, I got laid off. Things are pretty rough," he began, stumbling over his words. "I was thinking maybe you could help me out financially." His request hung in the air, audacious and somewhat insulting given our history. "And, maybe we could start over, rebuild. I mean, if you apologize to me and my mom and show some commitment here," he added, his voice trailing off, hopeful yet uncertain. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of his proposal. "Ryan, you really think I'd come back to support you and your parents after you kicked me out? Now that you're out of a job, suddenly all your high and mighty principles are gone." There was a pause. "So, that's a no?" he asked, sounding smaller and deflated. "Ryan, I'm doing really well, and honestly, I'm enjoying my freedom too much to give it up again. I hope you find your feet, but it won't be with me." My words were firm, sealing the end of our relationship. After hanging up, I felt a surge of empowerment. Ryan's call, although ridiculous, had reaffirmed something vital for me. I was truly free now, and no offer or plea was going to change that. As I hung up the phone, I took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The last remnants of my old life with Ryan had finally been severed, and with that came a new sense of clarity. I realized that the struggles I faced weren't just about a failed marriage. They were about rediscovering myself in a world that constantly tried to define me. In the quiet of my new apartment, I began to see the bigger picture. Life wasn't about fitting into someone else's mold or living up to expectations that never aligned with who I truly was. It was about embracing the parts of myself that made me unique, my love for words, my drive for independence, and my refusal to settle for anything less than what I deserved. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the city buzz with life. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. My career was thriving, my friendships were rekindled, and most importantly, I had learned the value of standing up for myself. I had allowed love to blind me to my own worth, but now, with those lessons behind me, I knew that my future would be different, one where I called the shots. There would be more challenges ahead, no doubt, but I was ready for them. I had survived the storm, and now I could finally enjoy the calm. With every new day, I was reclaiming my life on my own terms with no compromises. It was a journey of rediscovery and resilience, and I knew I was capable of facing whatever came next. As I finished my coffee, I smiled to myself, knowing that the best chapters of my story were still unwritten, and this time, I would be the sole author of my destiny.